In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, stands a quiet white house that has carried a dark reputation for more than a century. Known as the Villisca Axe Murder House, it became the site of one of the most brutal and mysterious crimes in American history. In the early hours of June 10th, 1912, 8 people were found murdered inside, 6 members of the Moore family and 2 young house guests. The killings were carried out with an axe taken from the home itself. The crime shocked the nation, and what followed only deepened the mystery. Suspects came and went, confessions surfaced and fell apart, and no one was ever convicted. For years, the story has lived on as both true crime and legend. Visitors now claim the house didn't just hold on to what happened that night. They say something stayed behind. Footsteps in empty rooms, voices in the dark, and an overwhelming feeling that you are not alone. But when we step beyond the fear and the folklore, the Villisca case becomes something even more unsettling. Not just because of what happened, because of what we never got answered. I'm Johnny Clash. I'm a dad, a gamer, a former pro wrestler, and a lifelong observer of the unexplained. I'm not here to convince or dismiss. I'm here to document, to listen, and to stay with questions that do not resolve neatly. This is Paranormal Unsettled. In the southwest corner of Iowa, there's a small town called Villisca. The name is said to come from a Native American word meaning pretty place. And on any given afternoon, when the sun is cutting through the fields and the streets are quiet, you can almost see why they called it that. But then there's another name, Villisca, and some locals say it, and that one means evil place. And after the night on June 9th of 1912, Villisca would never fully shake that second name. There is a house there, a modest white frame structure on a quiet residential street. From the outside, it looks like every other home in every other small Midwestern town. You would drive past it and not think twice. But the town of Villisca has thought about it every day for over 100 years because of what was discovered inside that one morning. 8 people bludgeoned to death in their beds. 6 of them were children. The killer was never convicted. The case was never truly closed, and the house itself, the same walls, the same rooms, the same floorboards, are still standing, still accepting visitors. And according to every investigator who has ever walked through it after dark, it's still very much occupied. This is the Villisca Axe Murder House, and unlike the Sally House, where we spent time asking whether the central tragedy actually happened, here, there's no mythology to untangle, no disputed records, no legend that may or may not be true. This one is all the way real, and that changes everything. To understand what Villisca became, you have to understand what it was. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. This story is brutal and certainly not for the faint of heart. There are things you're about to hear, some for the first time, that will turn your stomach. This one took me a long time to get through, especially being a dad of 2. But here we go. Ironically, the Villisca Axe Murder House sits at 508 East 2nd Street. Now, does that sound familiar? Because the Sally House, which we only covered last week, sits at 508 North 2nd Street. A strange coincidence, though 120 miles apart. Are there more connections between these 2 houses? We will see in just a little bit. Now let's talk about what this town was in 1912. Villisca was a small but functioning Midwestern town of about 2,500 people. Trains came through daily. Businesses lined the street. The CB&Q railroad line had helped it grow into a legitimate trade hub. People knew each other there. They went to the same churches, attended the same events, and trusted their neighbors. The Moore family fit right into the center of all of that. Josiah B. Moore was 43 years old, a respectable local businessman. His wife Sarah was 39. They had 4 children. Herman, who was 11, Mary Catherine, who everyone called Catherine, was 10. Arthur Boyd, who went by just Boyd, was 7, and little Paul Vernon, who was only 5 years old. By all accounts, they were well liked. They were good people, the kind of family that showed up in a small town and makes it better. And on the evening of June 9th, the Moore family attended a Children's Day program at the local Presbyterian church, an end-of-year Sunday school performance that Sarah had helped organize. 2 of Catherine's friends came along for the night. The Stillinger sisters, Lena Gertrude, who was age 11, and Ina May, who was age 8, daughters of a family who lived on a farm about 7 miles outside of the town. Josiah had called the Stillinger home that afternoon and asked if the girls could spend the night. It was cleared. It was ordinary. The kind of thing that happened all the time in a town like Villisca. It still happens today. The program ended around 9:30 that evening, and the Moore family walked home. They were just 3 blocks away from the church, with the Stillinger sisters in tow. They got inside somewhere around 9:45 or 10, and no one on that street ever saw them alive again. Sometime between midnight and 5 in the morning, someone entered the Moore house and killed all 8 people inside. Josiah and Sarah first, in the master bedroom. Then the 4 more children in the adjacent rooms upstairs. Then Lena and Ina Stillinger in the guest room downstairs. The weapon was an axe, believed to have just been taken from the Moore's own coal shed in the backyard. What the killer did with it goes beyond what most people can hold in their heads without putting it down. Josiah was struck with the blade of the axe and beaten an estimated 30 times. The blows were so forceful they left marks in the walls and the ceiling above the bed, marks that are still there today. You can actually see them. The other 7 victims were killed with the blunt side of the axe, a deliberate distinction, said to help the murders happen quicker rather than having a blade get stuck. After the Stillinger girls were killed downstairs, the killer went back upstairs and attacked the already dead bodies of the Moore family, striking them additional times, rendering several faces unrecognizable. And then, the killer walked calmly through the house, and he performed a series of deliberate, thoughtful acts. Every mirror in the home was covered, and covering mirrors was a common practice during wakes and funerals at the time, which raises its own ritualistic questions. The window blinds were drawn. On the 2 windows that had no blinds, pieces of the family's clothing were draped over them. The axe was carried into the girls' room downstairs, was wiped down, and leaned against the wall. A lamp upstairs had its glass chimney removed and its wick turned down to the faintest possible glow. In another weird act that may also have been tied to some sort of ritual, a 4-pound slab of raw bacon had apparently been removed from the icebox after the murders and just left on the floor. Sometimes described as wrapped in a towel or placed near the axe in the room where the Stillinger sisters were found. Food also sat untouched on the table beside a basin of bloody water in the kitchen. Investigators believe that every victim except Lena had been asleep when they were attacked. And then, this is the part that makes my heart race, my eyes water, my face turn red with anger and disgust. Lena appeared to have been awakened and possibly fought back, as she was discovered lying crosswise on the bed with what was believed to be a defensive wound on her arm. Her body appeared to have been moved after death, and some of her undergarments have been removed. The positioning of her body led investigators to consider whether the killer may have attempted some form of assault. However, later investigations reportedly found no evidence that assault had occurred. Just murder. And then, whoever did all of that just walked out of the house and disappeared forever. The next morning, June 10th, a neighbor named Mary Peckham grew concerned. It was getting late and the Moores hadn't come out to begin their morning chores. She knocked. No one answered. She then called Ross Moore, who was Josiah's brother, who came with a spare key. He entered the house. He opened the parlor and found the door to the guest room. He looked inside and saw the Stillinger sisters. He came back outside pale, trembling, and he called for help. Within minutes, word spread through Villisca. People came running before law enforcement could even secure the scene, and that was the first disaster after the murders. In 1912, crime scene protocol was essentially non-existent. Neighbors tracked through the house. People opened doors, looked into rooms. They touched things without thinking. Potential evidence was stepped on and lost before anyone with authority could even stop it. The house became both a crime scene and chaos at the same time. The county sheriff and coroner would later hold an inquest just one day after discovery on June 11th, interviewing 13 witnesses, but the damage to the physical evidence was already done. Doctors determined the murders had taken place between midnight and 5 in the morning. One more detail emerged that has stuck with investigators ever since. 2 spent cigarette butts were found in the attic. The killer had been inside the house before the family even arrived home from church. He had gone up to the attic and waited. While Josiah read to the children and Sarah put the little ones to bed and the Stillinger girls settled into the guest room downstairs, someone was crouched in the attic above them in the dark, waiting. The investigation that followed was by most accounts a disaster. Multiple suspects emerged over the weeks and months and years after the murders, and not one of them was ever successfully convicted. The case became one of the most complicated and contested in Iowa history, generating grand jury hearings, trials, and a prominent slander suit, and a political fallout that destroyed at least one public career. It also eventually helped establish what would become the Iowa State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. Now, these were the most prominent suspects in the case. Frank Jones, who was a Villisca resident and Iowa State Senator. Josiah had worked for Jones at his implement store for years before leaving to open his own business, and notably, taking the lucrative John Deere dealership contract with him when he went. Jones held a deep grudge. One theory is that Jones hired a man named William Mansfield, known as Insane Blackie, to carry out the murders. Mansfield was an ex-convict with a violent history and was linked by circumstance to a string of axe murders in Colorado Springs, Palo, Kansas, and later in Illinois. The Burns Detective Agency of Kansas City considered him their prime suspect, but payroll records placed Mansfield in Illinois at the night of the Villisca murders. He was released and later sued the detective who accused him, and he won. Now here's another one. Paul Mueller is a compelling suspect, and the suspect in most people's minds who have studied this case. Paul was a German immigrant, drifter, and logger who was the subject and theory put forward in 2017 by journalist and author Bill James and his daughter Rachel in their book, The Man from the Train. Mueller was a suspect in a series of similar murders across the Midwest and beyond, cases that shared key details with Villisca, including the targeting of young girls and the covering of mirrors. James built a compelling case on circumstantial evidence, but without physical proof, and with all of that evidence tampered with, it just remained a theory. One of the most compelling arguments against Paul was when the neighbors saw him walking to the train on the night of the murders and called out for him. He didn't respond. Despite the disturbing parallels, no physical evidence has ever conclusively tied Mueller to the Villisca murders, leaving the theory unresolved and heavily debated among true crime historians and investigators. Henry Lee Moore is another name thrown out there, no relation to the family. He was convicted months after the Villisca murders for killing his own mother and grandmother with an axe. He was suspected of being a serial killer responsible for multiple similar crimes across the Midwest. The similarities were hard to ignore, but he was never formally charged in connection with Villisca. Now here's a familiar name who was accused, who we spoke about last season. After the 1892 Lizzie Borden murder trials, many people viewed John Morse as secretive and suspicious. He also had connections to Iowa and ties to the region, which fueled speculation after the Villisca Axe murders. However, it was later revealed that John Morse died 3 months before the Villisca murders even took place, officially eliminating him as a suspect. But the most compelling argument comes in the form of a peeping Tom, someone with a known history of waiting, watching, and who actually confessed to the murders. Reverend Lynn George Kelly, an English-born traveling minister who had come to Villisca specifically for the Children's Day program, the same program the Moores attended on the night of the murders. He had a disturbing background. He had suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent, was known as a peeper and arson, and had reportedly asked multiple women and girls to pose nude for him. He left Villisca on the 5:19 train the morning of June 10th, hours before the bodies were officially discovered, and reportedly told fellow passengers on that train that 8 people had been murdered in Villisca with nobody telling him prior. Kelly later confessed to the murders in court, claiming a demon made him do it. Seems like something we've seen before. But 2 separate juries didn't believe him. The first trial was a hung jury. The second trial was acquittal. He walked, and he claimed the confessions were coerced. Kelly eventually moved from the Midwest to New England, where his behavior grew more unstable over time. At one point, he served as a chaplain for the New Jersey chapter of the KKK, even delivering prayers before cross burnings. He died in 1959 at the age of 80 years too long, at Islip Hospital in New York, a well-known psychiatric institution at the time, and was buried alongside his wife in Woodland Cemetery in the Bronx. Over a century later, no one has officially been held accountable. The case sits open in the cold case files in Iowa history, one of the most overanalyzed and least resolved murders the state has ever produced. Every thread eventually frays before it ties anything shut.
Right back after crucial break.
The Villisca Axe Murder House occupies a different cultural lane than most haunted locations, and that's worth acknowledging before we go any further here. They claim to not advertise the murders, and most of it is spread by word of mouth. But I think the big sign outside that says Villisca Axe Murder House does a fine job. Not to mention all of the targeted Facebook ads. Most haunted house stories carry some version of the same uncertainty we talked about in the Sally House episode. Was there really a death? Did someone really suffer here? The documentation is thin. The legend grew to fill in the gaps, and somewhere between history and mythology, the story became unverifiable. Villisca has no such ambiguity. The murders actually happened. The victims were real. Their names are documented. Their graves are in the Villisca Cemetery. Reverend Kelly is buried only 30 minutes from where I sit right now. The trial records themselves exist. The newspaper coverage from 1912 exists. The evidence, the photos, all of it is real. All of it is there. This is not a story that was handed down in whispers and embellished over time. It is an archived historical tragedy that the entire town of Villisca, the state of Iowa, and ultimately the entire country pretty much knows about. Now here's where we have to be honest with what we're dealing with and how it differs from every other case we'll cover this season. The grief was real. The trauma was real. Everything I just said about this case was so gruesome because it was so real. Whether something like that can leave an imprint on a physical space, that's where the conversation becomes more complicated and where we're headed next. The horror already existed long before a single camera crew arrived. The camera simply just pointed at it. Now what we know is those cigarette butts that were found in the attic were never DNA tested, despite the technology eventually making that possible. There was also a watch fragment that was found in the girl's bedroom, but never matched anybody. The modern tools of true crime investigation, forensic genealogy, advanced DNA profiling, all of it, have never been fully applied to this case with complete access to the remaining evidence. There has been renewed interest in doing so, but as of this episode right now, the murders still remain unresolved, and perhaps they want it that way. Now from the paranormal side, the questions are different but just as unresolved. And the transformation from the true crime landmark to paranormal destination has its own complicated history. For most of the 20th century, the house was simply just preserved as the site of one of the darkest moments in Iowa history. It passed through multiple owners before historian Darwin Lynn and Martha Lynn purchased it in 1994 and spent years restoring it to its 1912 appearance. They removed modern renovations, they stripped out the plumbing and electricity, and turned the home into a historically accurate time capsule of the crimes committed. The house was added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1998. Today, the house sits almost exactly as it did in 1912. No electricity, no plumbing, very little modern intrusion. Investigators who study residual hauntings, the theory that traumatic events can leave an imprint on a location that replays over and over again under the right conditions, consider the Villisca Axe Murder House one of the best preserved environments of its kind in the country because it's all stripped down. 8 violent deaths in a single night, nearly every room touched by violence. A building carefully maintained in its original state for over a century. If residual energy can attach itself to places, this is exactly the kind of place believers argue it would attach to. Now, whether you believe that or not, something continues to bring serious investigators back, and the experiences they report, they're not usually minor. Now that changes the weight of the story. When you watch a dramatized retelling of the Villisca murders, that fiction is not whether something happened. We know 8 people were murdered in that house. The fiction, when it exists, lies in the why and the who. The first documented paranormal investigation did not take place until 1999. After that, the floodgates opened. Ghost Adventures came, the BuzzFeed crew came, YouTubers eventually came, and unlike cases such as the Sallie House, where dramatized retellings often added fictional layers to an already disputed story, the Villisca investigations were built on something undeniable. Does that make the paranormal claims more credible? That's the question we're about to find out. Having no electricity is one of the biggest deals when it comes to exploring this home. That means no interference from copper wires, telephone lines, or any technology. An EMF reading here is most likely to come from something lingering or the cell phone in your pocket. But it also means when it gets dark out there in southwestern Iowa and the door closes behind you, it goes completely dark. No light switches, no ambient glow from appliances. You brought everything you need, or you have nothing. And in that kind of dark, with that kind of history pressing in on you from all 4 walls, the house has a way of communicating whether you want it to or not. Like I mentioned, the first formal paranormal investigation took place in 1999. A team set up sensitive microphones and infrared cameras throughout the house, and they stayed the night. They reported unexplained noises and captured what they described as a small glowing orb on the camera. Something one investigator described as borderline demonic in nature and distinctly non-human. That team declared the house haunted and importantly said they believed they had made contact with something other than the victims. That distinction, that whatever is in the Villisca house may or may not only be the Moore family, has echoed through every investigation since. Now, as usual, there are some familiar names who have brought this house into the forefront of paranormal, I'll say, entertainment. Now, first up is Jack Osborne, who is actually a great asset to the paranormal field, with multiple shows and a deep respect for the locations he visits, and is listed on the Villisca Axe Murder website as one of the most notable investigators who has brought the property national attention. His years of paranormal work across multiple Travel Channel series has consistently brought him to heavyweight locations, even with his dad Ozzy, and Villisca is very much in that category. Now, Ghost Adventures just couldn't keep their hands off the place. They brought Zach Baggins, Nick Groff, and Aaron Goodwin to Villisca for Season 4 of the series, which aired in 2010. This was an early episode, and Villisca was already considered one of the heaviest locations they had tackled to that point. The attic, where the killer hid before the murders, became the focal point of their investigation. The accounts from that episode described the attic as distinctly different from the rest of the house. It felt heavier, more oppressive, the kind of room that sits wrong on you even after nothing obviously happens. Ghost Adventures returned to the evidence on a later Aftershock special, revisiting what they captured during that initial lockdown.
I want to see if I can give her some kind of closure by you speaking to me right now. Do you recognize Linda? All right, we'll review this audio.
If I can give her some kind of closure by you speaking to me right now.
What is that?
That's a voice.
Now, Sam and Colby, we mentioned last week, visited this house right before they visited the Sallie house. And they got some interesting information, which we mentioned involved the basement of the Sallie house and Johnny Hauser from Villisca. This episode is from December of 2021, and regardless of how you feel about Sam and Colby, I think it's worth going to watch, regardless of how you feel about the two. Not only for the activity they find, or whether you believe it or not, but they speak with Rachel James, who is the author of the book that accused Mueller. She has her own theories, but also Johnny Hauser gives a full, in-depth walkthrough of his experience as well as the history of the house. They came in with real intent in trying to understand the case, not just chase evidence, but actually sit with the history. They sat in that attic and they experienced some strange things, not to mention possible contact with Mueller.
Was it Paul? Do you know Paul?
Yes.
You know Paul? Paul Miller.
Yeah. We're talking about it.
Yeah, we're talking about Paul
Right
Miller.
there.
So,
I enjoyed it.
Oh my God.
Did you make Paul do it?
If I was him,
the spirit wanted
You
to do it.
might
I
have.
enjoyed it if I was him.
yes.
Villisca is a hotbed of paranormal investigations. Kelsey Davies, Project Fear, Paranormal Files, Haunted Nights, BuzzFeed Unsolved, you name it, and they've been there. Now there's one incident at the Villisca house that doesn't fit neatly into any of the investigation categories and deserves its own mention, because it's one of the most disturbing documented events in modern history of the property. In November of 2014, a man arrived at the house for what was described as a recreational paranormal investigation. The caretaker, Johnny Hauser, warned him not to bring his hunting knife inside. He brought it anyway. At around 12:45 in the morning, which investigators note is the approximate time the murders are believed to have begun in 1912, his partner found him alone in the northwest bedroom, stabbed in the chest, apparently self-inflicted. He had no memory of doing it. He was airlifted to Creighton University Medical Center in Omaha. He survived and later returned to the house and apologized for his behavior. No one has ever been able to clearly explain what happened to him in that room. And then there's the train. Every night around 2 in the morning, a train passes through Villisca, just like it did in 1912. You can hear the whistle from the house, and investigators and overnight guests consistently report that the 2 a.m. train seems to trigger something, that the residual activity picks up around that time, that the house feels different in the minutes after the whistle passes. Some researchers believe it has to do with the timing of the original murders, which also occurred in those early morning hours. Whether it's the sound, the timing, or something else entirely, it's been noted independently by enough visitors that it's become part of the documented pattern of this location. What the evidence says, taken together, is something harder to dismiss than any singular account on its own. Voices captured in rooms that were empty, cold spots in specific areas, particularly the attic. Objects moving, the psychological weight of the house, noted not just by believers, but by skeptics who came in specifically to challenge the narrative and left quieter than they arrived. The guest room downstairs where Lena and Ina Stillinger were killed is consistently described as the heaviest room in the house. And once again back to the attic, the room where the killer waited, is described by almost everyone who goes up there as deeply, specifically wrong in a way that most investigators struggle to articulate. The house is there, it's still open, still dark at night, and by most accounts, still very much active. Should I visit? Leave a comment and let me know. Part of why this story refuses to leave is that justice was never delivered. And that's the kind of thing that sits in the soil of a place like this. Whether or not you believe in the residual energy, you kind of understand the weight of the unresolved grief. Villisca has been carrying it since 1912, and it hasn't gotten any lighter. There is also something specific about the way the house was preserved. When Darwin and Martha Lynn restored it to its 1912 condition in the 90s, they made a decision that most historical preservation efforts don't make. They don't just keep the structure, they stripped it back, period-appropriate furnishings. The house that investigators and visitors walk into today is as close as it is possible to get into the house that existed on that June night. That level of preservation is rare. Hopefully something like this is what we see with the Conjuring house in the near future. But it also means that when people report experiences there, they are reporting them in a context that has been deliberately kept as close to the original as possible. There are fewer variables, no electricity, no modern intrusion. The house is what it was, and that makes what happened inside it harder to explain away. The town itself is also part of the narrative. Villisca is small, just over 2,000 people as of today. The history of the Moore family murders is essentially woven into the identity of the community. The house is on a regular residential street. The cemetery where the victims are buried is down the road. The Presbyterian church, where the family spent their last evening together, is still there. This is not a story that has been relocated to a museum or a tourist tourist destination. It exists inside the town the way the town has always existed, and you feel that way when you're there. And then there's the simple, hard truth of 8 people who went to sleep expecting to wake up that morning. That's the thing that gets you if you let it. Not the EVPs, not the cold spots, not the attic or the covered mirrors or the train whistling at 2 a.m. It's the image of the 5-year-old in his bed, or the 2 girls who were just having a sleepover, or a family who walked home from church on a summer night and never knew that someone was already upstairs waiting. You don't have to believe in anything paranormal to find the Villisca house deeply, thoroughly unsettling. You only have to remember what actually happened there, and the house, standing exactly as it stood that night, will never let you forget. Through all of this, the investigations continue. Researchers continue. The cold case remains open, and the house on that Iowa street continues to receive visitors who come for different reasons. Some for the ghost stories, some for the true crime, some for reasons they can't fully explain even to themselves. All of them walk out different than the way they walked in. The Villisca Axe Murder House is not the most famous haunted location in America. It's not the one with the Hollywood franchise or the icon that everyone recognizes on a t-shirt. What it is the most honest one. The grief inside is not a legend. The people inside it were real. The injustice that attached itself to those walls in 1912 is documented, verifiable, and completely unresolved. If the dead can linger in places where their stories were left unfinished, then Villisca has every reason to be haunted, whether the lights flicker or not. In the next episode, we're heading into a place where the past doesn't sit quietly. It pushes back. The Bel Air House. Tucked into a small Ohio River town, this 1800s home has built a reputation that goes way beyond your typical ghost story. People don't just say it's haunted, they say it's hostile. Reports of being scratched, hearing voices with no source, and objects moving on their own have turned this house into one of the most feared locations in the country. I'm Johnny Clash, and this is Paranormal Unsettled.
Paranormal Unsettled is written and produced by Johnny Clash. For more unsettling content, including case files, interviews, virtual tours, and things better left unexplained, subscribe on YouTube at Johnny Clash XP. Do you believe in the unexplained? Show the world. Visit the XP store at shop.paranormalunsettled.com. Follow along on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok at Paranormal Unsettled for more stories, clips, and updates.
Like and subscribe.